Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and I just got back from the new film X-Men Days of Future Past. X-Men Days of Future Past was probably my most anticipated movie of the summer and possibly of my entire life, because I have had love of the original Days of Future Past storyline written by Chris Claremont and John Byrne since I was about 7 years old. And I've always wanted them to make a movie of Days of Future Past. It seemed like a good idea. It's only 2 issues. And so the expectation, I guess, for this movie for me was probably too high. I don't really think it lives up to those expectations, but I don't think any movie really could. However, I still think it's a hell of a good X-Men movie and hell of a good summer blockbuster. Despite me blowing my expectations completely out of proportions, it is good at being that big blockbuster X-Men film that we used to get when Bryan Singer directed them. But I think this film succeeds in kind of almost the same way that Singer's better of his previous 2 X-Men films, X2, succeeded in taking a story, a Chris Claremont story again, whereas that was God Loves, Man Kills. This is Days of Future Past. He doesn't closely adapt either of the stories, but he adapts them to work within kind of the X-Men story they already have going. It kind of shows the promise that film kind of led us to believe that the X-Men films would be very good after that. And this film has a lot of that as well, where you feel more faith in the X-Men films after having seen this film, much like X2. And it feels more like reading an X-Men comic than I think any X-Men film I've seen thus far. First Class kind of does, but not as much as this, although I think I might like First Class a bit more. A lot of big X-Men stories, certain characters are important, but a lot of the other mutants don't really get their due, and the X-Men films have far too many mutants in them to begin with, and I think this film especially does. But if you don't let that kind of bother you, and if you're not a fan of Blink or Colossus or Kitty Pryde, and you wish they got more of their due that they do in the comics, this film isn't really for you. But what this film is trying to do, it does it very excellently, focusing on characters like Magneto and Professor X, and of course Wolverine, and probably having one of the best portrayals of Mystique I've seen yet. In the future, in about 10 years from now, supposedly, in this alternate future timeline where the Sentinels have completely taken over. They have enslaved pretty much everyone who's a mutant or a human, and everyone lives in this grim apocalyptic world except for the resistance to that, led by Professor X and Magneto. This one group with Kitty Pryde and Iceman and Colossus and Bishop and Sunspot and Blink, Kitty Pryde has found a way to transport someone's consciousness into their body a few days before. How that makes sense with their mutant powers, I don't exactly know, but of course they couldn't put Rachel Summers in. I'm not going to get into that whole thing. It doesn't really make sense, but just there's a lot of things in these X-Men movies that don't make sense. You just kind of have to go with it. But in the comic, it was Rachel Summers, who's a telepath, who's kind of like Jean Grey and Scott Summers' kid, which makes a lot more sense. But anyway, in the movie, Kitty Pryde can do this for reasons that make no sense. They find out that she can do this, and so they come up with the idea that they will send someone their consciousness back to before the incident that started all this, which was the murder of Bolivar Trask by Mystique. And they send Wolverine because apparently his healing power will be able to heal his mind, which like kind of doesn't make sense, because then why was his mind all messed up from the Weapon X thing? But again, too much sense thinking about continuity and how this could actually work. Doesn't really hold up in this movie. But so anyway, I'll let that go. So he goes back to 1973, where he has to get Charles Xavier to help him, young Charles Xavier, played by James McAvoy, and get Michael Fassbender's Magneto out of prison and help them and have them reunite and stop Mystique from murdering Bolivar Trask and change the events of this dystopian future and set things right so that the world won't turn out to be this grim, terrible place where mutants are hunted by the Sentinels. My dad actually had picked up the original issue because he was reading comics at that time, and he told me about how when he picked up the issue of Days of Future Past, he had never read an X-Men comic before, And it was very confusing because suddenly everyone's dead and you're in this dystopian future and you didn't know what was going on. It was weird, and he didn't really get into X-Men then. He did later. But one of the things I think of when I think of X-Men comics, and particularly Claremont's run on X-Men, is it was very complicated and had lots of continuity, and storylines would often have a lot of moving parts in them, and you'd always have to think about other issues you had read. And I think X-Men Days of Future Past does that better than any X-Men movie has before. You're not setting anybody up, you're not having to do an origin story. X-Men Days of Future Past uses our collective pop culture knowledge of the previous 4 X-Men movies and uses them with its sense of continuity to tell a story, much like how Captain America Winter Soldier did recently. And I like that comic book movies are moving in this direction, because it reminds me of reading an actual comic book. That's an interesting place for comic book movies to go. It's an organic place for comic book movies to go, and this film reflects other studios beyond Marvel Studios. Even though this is a Marvel film, it's not a Marvel Studios film, trying to do that. And this film, I think, succeeds very well at that, combining both the old franchise and the new franchise. I think it's kind of smart having the old franchise be the future and the prequel franchise be the past. And it kind of shows a kind of both moving forward and acknowledging the superhero movies of the past decade, which certainly will look a lot more outdated now, because I think we know more of what we're doing with superhero movies than we did in the early 2000s. But that aesthetic, that matrixy aesthetic with the jumpsuits and the compromise superhero movie, you couldn't do this at the time, so we did this instead. We had to change this character to make this work. We have to cast this person in because they're big at the time, not because they're right for the role. When you look at the future stuff, I think it kind of reflects more of Singer's past franchise, whereas the rest of it plays more like a sequel to First Class that Singer happens to direct. Now, he's not as good at the prequel stuff as Matthew Vaughn, and it does very much feel like a Singer story. He plays more like an old school science fiction director, both caring about the characters certainly, but I think he almost cares more about having the narrative move along, and not in the bad movie way where the narrative kind of chugs along. I look at this more like the narrative kind of invites you in, and I'm always so into it during this movie that I wasn't even really thinking about those things I was complaining about. I was wrapped up in it and I was engaged, and I think Singer can do that with a plot very well. He did that as well with X2, where there's like a million different mutants going on. There's various different storylines, but I always get really into that movie. And I think that speaks to Singer's strengths as a blockbuster filmmaker. Now, I haven't seen him make a blockbuster film this good since X2. The interesting thing about Singer and how he directs X-Men films, in the first X-Men film, he didn't know anything about the X-Men, and it very much shows. And in the second X-Men film, you think like, hey, I think he spent like a couple weeks actually reading X-Men issues. And now when we get to this one, it feels like he really knows this universe. And I don't think I've ever seen a director, through directing a superhero franchise, understand the source material more as they directed more of the films. It's interesting, and I feel like Days of Future Past continues what he was already doing with X2. It's like continuing an evolution that I thought had kind of ended. It's a stronger film than you'd expect from him at this time. I was a little worried, to be honest. I was half like, this could really work out because X2 was so good, but he hasn't really made anything as good as this in a while. And he does have cool enough action set pieces that it feels like a big Hollywood summer blockbuster. Quicksilver has a really cool sequence where he gets Magneto out of jail, the fights with the Sentinels, especially Blink's portals, who, if you actually do get to see the film in 3D, when you look into the portals, it looks like a different plane of existence. They obviously changed the story, whereas in the original story it was Kitty Pryde's consciousness that got sent back. And in this film, they chose Wolverine. Maybe that doesn't really make any sense, but it makes sense in terms of the fact that every X-Men film is written, and I've read this from various people who've written X-Men films, that when you're given the assignment, the producer says, this isn't just an X-Men movie, it's about Wolverine and the X-Men. In that sense, I think it makes sense that they changed it from Kitty Pryde to Wolverine. Wolverine exists in those two different timelines, so thus they can use him as both, and it kind of was a good compromise, really. Magneto and Professor X storyline with McAvoy and Fassbender, I think they get to do more with the characters in this film than Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart, who are still very good, and I like them in the previous films, but it feels like they, especially Fassbender, seems to embody Magneto so well. He feels straight out of the comic book in such an excellent way, you know, and he has that kind of old school kind of German look to him that just works so organically. Ian McKellen was a lot better in the previous X-Men films than this X-Men film, really. Felt like oftentimes they're just kind of standing around looking at Wolverine be asleep, as interesting as that is. And James McAvoy, you know, the whole plot line with him and this weird drug that lets him walk but messes with his powers is a little bizarre. I liked how they incorporated kind of what was going on politically with Vietnam and everything with his storyline. I've been happy with Jennifer Lawrence as Mystique, and Mystique is very important to the Days of Future Past storyline. She's the one who, in both the original comic and this one, assassinates someone and puts forward the events to the future. And in this film they make it, she's even more essential to the storyline because they use her DNA to make new Sentinels that can shapeshift and adapt to fighting mutants and fight in any condition, really, making these Sentinels almost unstoppable, even though it takes many decades to get that technology ready, but it's still important. And so that's another thing, they have to not just make sure she doesn't kill this guy, but that she doesn't get captured and they don't test her DNA. Mystique's a really great character, and I never liked Rebecca Romijn Stamos as Mystique. I thought that was really wasted potential because you need a good actress to play Mystique. She's a really good villain, she's a really good character, and she's an interesting character. She's a little crazy, and Jennifer Lawrence seems to get that very, very well. I haven't seen someone portray Mystique the way Jennifer Lawrence really did, and it speaks to her as an actress, but it also, I think, says that they're taking a lot of these characters more seriously. They obviously made that part bigger because it's Jennifer Lawrence and she's a huge movie star, but Mystique was a huge part of the storyline, so I'm glad that it kind of worked out because it makes sense, and Mystique's an interesting enough character that it works within an X-Men movie. She's always been an important part of X-Men, and gotten a good actress who can really handle a character like Mystique. This gets back to the kind of X-Men film we've all kind of wanted. The kind of X-Men film, if you liked X2, you would like. And also following up, X2 and X-Men First Class were my two favorite X-Men films. And I think this falls in line with that. I don't think I like it as much as either of those at this point. But with me and X-Men films, I grew up reading X-Men. I love the Claremont run many times. I'm going to get this on Blu-ray the day it comes out. I'm going to probably definitely see it in the theater again. And there's really no way I can fairly say where it would fit into the canon. But I can say I think it's a very strong X-Men movie. And it did feel like I'm reading an intriguing storyline and I'm flipping through those pages. And oftentimes with those, much like this movie, it's more about the narrative that keeps going and getting you deeper and deeper in and wanting you to read more and more issues. With this kind of an X-Men movie, I think this can do that just as well. And I really love it for that. I love this kind of a blockbuster. I think it's a strong comic book movie. I kind of think Captain America Winter Soldier is a lot tighter and better comic book film, really. In a lot of ways, this made kind of my dreams come true because I got a cool X-Men movie, and that's really what I wanted. Could it live up to my impossible expectations of wanting to see something as cool as that comic? No, I don't think anything really could live up to that. It's just like impossible. But I think this film does a very, very good job, and it's a very good blockbuster. And as of this summer, I doubt I'll see a lot better blockbusters than this. Maybe I'm too much of an X-Men dork and other film critics won't agree, but I think it's a damn good comic book movie and a damn good X-Men movie and a damn good summer blockbuster, and I don't think you can go wrong with that on Memorial Day weekend. So if you have seen X-Men Days of Future Past and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. I have a playlist of all my previous X-Men reviews. I've reviewed all of the X-Men films and last year's The Wolverine, and also the pilot Pride of the X-Men. You can check all that out in my playlist, which will have an annotation below. Also, since you have stuck around, I will recommend that you stay till the end of the credits. There's kind of a rumor going around that there's nothing after the credits, and that is not true. But I stay anyway for comic book movies just in case, and there is something after the credits. Also, interesting to note for any of you Doctor Who fans, John Byrne, actually, who helped plot Days of Future Past, said he was very inspired by Day of the Daleks, which is a really good Doctor Who episode from the early 1970s, and stars John Pertwee. I don't know its availability, but you should check it out anyway.